Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Unposed British Science Week interviews. Today we've got a longer episode than normal as we get taken on a whirlwind tour from astrophysics to plant biology.
So my name is Jasmine and I'm joined by Professor Rene Breton, who is an astrophysicist, cyclist and a self-assumed geek. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jasmine.
So I'll start with the questions. So we'll do a little warm-up first. So it says on your website you're a self-assumed geek. So what does that entail?
Yeah, I don't know. I just came up with this term. I just like technology and physics and, science. But I think a lot of the time people think about these as, it's complex, complicated, or it's only for, super smart people. But I sort of don't really identify to being, either super smart or these things to be just very complex. So I just find, science and technology just fascinating, right? And just curiosity, it just drives my curiosity. So that's why, I say I'm a geek, because I just like, reading about these discoveries and whatnot. Yeah. But I'm just a normal person, really.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, it also says you're a cyclist. So how often do you cycle? Where do you go? What kind of trips do you do usually?
Yeah, I try to, these days, that's my primary sport. Growing up, I played pretty much like every sport that, was around, especially team sports, actually. So I did, basketball, ice hockey, because I'm actually North American, Canadian originally. Football, like soccer and whatnot. But then, I came to the point in my life where I just kept moving around and about every couple of years. So it felt a bit sometimes difficult to join, more like team sports. And also with my work, I travel a lot. So also I would, miss a lot. So cycling was kind of like a good fit. But actually, it's also a team sport in the sense that, you can cycle, socially with friends as part of a club. So actually, I almost prefer doing it socially, but when I can't, I can do it on my own. And I do it also, I can do it inside, with the turbo smart trainers these days. So I try to do, I try to do something like half an hour every day, and on the weekend, maybe, a couple of hours. So I do anywhere between 100 and 200 kilometers usually every week.
Wow, that's really impressive. Yeah. I think that's really nice to hear that people kind of put these things in there, like you said, like you put in your website to kind of highlight that you're not just about physics, even though it's a big part of your life, you're not just a physicist. You do loads of other things as well.
Actually, in high school, I was playing for the team, the team's basketball team, and the school's basketball team, and often, the big, the very sporty people are not necessarily the sort of academic, oriented ones. And so I used to be, slightly, I would not necessarily say bullied, but, people would kind of make fun a bit, of the fact that I was kind of good, getting good grades and things. But I really wanted to be, doing sports. And actually it's through, some good teachers that I had who kind of encouraged me to sort of push in science that I did. Otherwise I might have just followed the flow and sort of left a bit science, on the side, because I just wanted to be popular or whatnot. But it turns out one didn't exclude the other one, right? So I could be sort of a decent sports person, and also be good and do science, be good at academic subjects.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very common thing to a lot of young people in school. I had the same thing, people would make fun of me for, getting good grades and stuff like that. But I think teachers help with that often, don't they, to kind of push you. And I'm also quite sporty. I like doing loads of sports. So I think it's a big part of us physicists as well to kind of get a break from thinking hard and just
definitely. Either to start the day, to activate your body and then your brain, to start. These days I try to do it in the morning, but sometimes also at the end of the day is good, to let the pressure out, right? When you're frustrated. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Let's talk a bit about your profession. So you're a professor now of astrophysics. What's an ordinary day for you like, apart from the sport? What else do you do?
Yeah. Well, my typical work is a combination of research, but also teaching and administration. So, in my case, I've been very lucky to be successful at securing research grants. So it means that I can actually dedicate a bit more of my time to research. Because these grants, they basically pay for some of my salary and whatnot. So typically on an ordinary day, I will touch base with like my PhD students and the postdoctoral researchers who work in my team, and also undergrads who do their final projects with me. So I'll kind of like touch base with them, and then I'll try to if I can, I'll try to look at the latest results, and especially in the field that I work. And then I make my typical days, I try to make a to-do list of things I really should be doing. So it might be some analysis or something like that. So that's on the research side, but on top, interspersed with that, there's also the teaching, which well, sometimes can be frustrating, but also can be very rewarding. It depends. Like, sometimes you put a lot of effort in preparing your teaching, and then you show up and maybe students look a bit tired, or not like as many students as you would hope turn up to class or something. But actually, at the same time, when you teach and students are like connecting with what you're teaching, it's also extremely rewarding, and I think it makes up for all the shortcomings, really. So teaching preparation takes a lot of time. Often people think, oh yeah, you kind of like show up, you give the 1 hour lecture, and then maybe another day they give another hour, and then that's kind of it. Actually, for every 1 hour of teaching, there's probably something like 10 hours preparing or something like that. When you teach many years the same course, then it becomes a bit easier, but there's always things to tweak, I find. So it's a bit of preparing for teaching, a couple of days a week, and then the research. And the research is when you work, I mean, often things are project based, right? So you pick up, like, you have a research idea or something, something you like that challenges and you want to find the answer to. So typically there's the various phase of a project where you think about the idea, then you think how you're going to do it. Then often you need to get data. So for typical astronomers, you don't set up a lab experiment, but then the actual experiment basically involves taking data, right, with a telescope or something. So it's done through a competitive process. So you have to submit your idea with all the technical details of how you want to acquire the data and justify why. And then it's reviewed by peers. And so if your project is ranked high enough, then you can, eventually you'll get observations done. And then there's the analysis of the data. And then eventually, you do the interpretation and then publish the results. So that's the typical flow. So, and typically when you get to like sort of professor level and you have a research team, then you work on like a lot of projects at the same time, sometimes too many. And so, so typically I have like a combination of these projects running, and they're all at different stages. So I kind of do a bit of everything at the same time.
Okay, yeah, that sounds interesting to say the least. So you kind of touched base on this already, but so you said that, like, you're competing for funding and things like that. So especially now that during COVID we're kind of restricted in a lot of things that we can do. Why do you think it's important to study astrophysics? What kind of help does that give to us here on Earth, or as a humanity, or whatever?
Yeah, especially things like pandemic makes you take a bit of a step back, right, and think, okay, why am I doing this and whatnot. Yeah, obviously I'm very lucky because my research, I can continue doing it. I don't need access to a lab. Although for the last year, basically all the the major telescope facilities have been shut down or gradually restarted. But so in the short term, it's okay. You know, often you have like maybe a backlog of like data sitting on your desk ready to be analyzed. But in the long term, you know, eventually it becomes to the critical point where you need new data. Yeah. So I mean, I think the why hasn't really changed. So I think, you know, I mean, you know, in general, I think in a society in general, like, you know, especially in the modern societies, but it's always been true, that there's a certain wealth collectively. So it enables people to not just work on like subsistence, basically, right? And from like the dark ages or, you know, prehistoric times, now we can afford more and more of the sort of you know, extra, you know, you know, subsistence. So that, I mean, modern societies are mostly driven by services rather than actual subsistence. Now some services are more important than others, like on a day-to-day, but yet, you know, there's always been musicians, artists, and even scientists. And I think some of it, the reward is not necessarily on the short term, but it's a long-term thing for the society to evolve. So I think the basis of like fundamental research and fundamental science, like physics or maths, is driven by that. But, you know, if you had asked like 200 years ago, when, you know, Newton or the Leibniz and these people like develop integrals or, you know, calculus, you know, people would have thought, oh, that's completely useless. Like, how, you know, is it going to help you with my potato farm? But, you know, now we can see actually to calculate important things, to, you know, do farming or other things, you know, we rely on those. So I think astrophysics is the same. So, you know, it's like position of stars, you know, is important for like space navigation, you know, all the orbital mechanics, you know, and of motion of planets, you know, so everything we know about space and space traveling, you know, rely on fundamental astrophysics. And then even like discoveries like, you know, our better understanding of gravity, which is something that I've been connected to through my research testing gravity. It also has an impact because for instance, global positioning system, you know, the GPS, we need to use corrections from Einstein's relativity into the positioning. Otherwise, we would get the positions wrong by a couple of meters. And, you know, it makes a big difference, right? If you try to land a plane, or if you do something else that relies on accurate positions. So there's all kinds of things like that come through that, you know, maybe on the spot doesn't seem like so relevant, but in the long term, it's part of all these serendipitous discoveries. Same for the internet, you know, came up with people doing particle physics, astrophysics, like especially radio astronomers. They were, you know, at the core of the development of Wi-Fi, you know, technology in the first place. And also for medical imaging, for instance, the principle that enables us to do scans, like these 3D scans and nice pictures of the human body. I mean, the technique was developed for radio astronomy in the first place. So I think it's all of these things really that's, you know, driving. And then sometimes, you know, we also maybe contribute more, I don't know, directly. So in the last couple of years, I've been more interested in sustainability and things like that. So I apply actually some of my skills for remote sensing and Earth observations. So I do a bit of research trying to track invasive plants that, you know, propagate in other places that they're not used to be, either from, you know, just the global, you know, fact that, you know, things travel everywhere, or maybe sometimes even global warming or climate change. And those can have nasty effects on, say, food production. So, and the techniques to analyze space images is very similar to the ones we use for space, you know, cosmos observations. So, so I spend a bit of my time also on these, which, you know, is more direct impact, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the question that a lot of sort of like people who aren't in the academia or not doing sciences might be asking, like, why are we, you know, spending money looking at space or whatever when we have problems here? But I think a lot of people don't understand that part of that is actually helping the development down here as well.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's
Also,
important.
when you think about it, like the typical like sort of G20 or whatever countries, they invest only a few % of their total GDPs into science, and research. It's ridiculously small.
Yeah.
And like when you look at the amount, okay, maybe tens of millions can seem a lot. Like say if someone needs, I don't know, like some medical care or whatnot, but at the same time when you look at like the total investments for like a lot of other things, it's a drop in the sea, really.
I think a really good example of that is the COVID vaccine
Mm.
development now, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, they've only just come up with it, and how has it come up so quickly? But that's kind of, I like to think that when we kind of put our resources to science, that's how fast we can actually do these things. And well, with the COVID vaccine as well, it's been developed, like they've been developing it for years actually. But now that we actually have the need and we can put the resources in, we actually see the results. So I think that's
right.
If any funders are listening, they can put some money to the research again. So you kind of already mentioned that you do a lot of things that aren't necessarily directly related to astrophysics or physics in general. So do you work with other sciences or other scientists a lot? Is that like part of your career, or has it been?
Yeah, so in the past, it was mostly with astronomers, maybe sometimes, a bit with mathematicians, but mostly astronomers. But it's maybe in the last like 3 or so years that I've been really, when I started doing this project on the remote sensing. And it's really nice because, that project actually, is a project also that's based on like, capital and like, research development with developing countries. So also it involves working, with poorer countries and working with people abroad who also do like their part of the research. So it's not just, me who comes and like, is like, oh, here it is.
Yeah.
So these people, they work and like we're really a research team. And so I've worked with like people like plant biologists, engineers, people work in ecology, all kinds of fields like entomologists. And it's really nice because it was like this very diverse team really that make that project works. So we put together using Raspberry Pi cameras and computers, like really cheap equipment that people tinker with at home. So we put together a new like camera that can make images and 6 different colors actually at the same time, and we can mount it on a small quadcopter to take images of fields. So that was work with like an engineer, and then and then the people work on plants, they don't really know about that, but then at the same time like they were really important for us to understand like how to properly do ground measurements and things like that. So it's really interesting. And now I'm just starting to supervise a master's student who's working, who's jointly supervised with someone who works in the faculty of humanities, and that person works on like environment, ecology, and remote sensing. So yeah, it's really nice collaborations. And to be honest, like I believe these sort of collaborations will bring me very fresh new ideas also to port back into astrophysics. Because sometimes you work in it and then like say everyone uses like a specific software or a specific way to analyze the data, and then you talk to some other people and then they do things differently, and then maybe your way might be better for certain things, but then they do something that's probably better than you do for something else. And so this sort of like cross-talking is really nice to get.
Absolutely.
I've even like talked to people in the past who did theater. So I went to like some sort of like a forum where basically I was like the scientist, and then I was talking with people who did like theater and art, and they did plays connected to astronomy, for instance, and then they were talking to me about what they understood and what I understood, and then this connection also with even the arts is really interesting to get.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so nice to hear, kind of from a a physicist side as well, like that we do actually work with a lot of different people from different backgrounds, and that's, I think, one of the best things about thinking about a career in physics or in any science. So you already kind of mentioned that you do some work with sustainability. I was reading your website before this, and I saw that you've got this project on food security. Would you like to talk a bit more about that and explain kind of a bit more detail?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, yeah. So this project is what I alluded to earlier. So there's the project itself was very focused on one specific weed that's called Parthenium, and it grows about a meter tall, depending on the climate and water that it gets. But basically, something like a meter tall little bush. It makes these little white flowers, and so the issue with this is, first, it changes the chemistry of the soil around it. So typically, the plants that where it's indigenous, like in the Americas, the other plants are sort of okay coping with it, but it somehow made it across to Australia at some point, and then also in the sort of like southern part of Asia, like India. And Pakistan and neighboring countries, and the issue is that the other plants are not equipped to fight that one, so it changes the chemistry of the soil, and then once it starts spreading, the other species have a hard time even growing nearby. But also it spreads really rapidly, and it's one of these super plants that's got like these a lot of seeds, and the seeds are like super lightweight and they float, so it can fly off, it can like travel on waterways, so it can spread really efficiently. On top of it, the plant kind of looks a bit like the little white flowers that people tend to put in bouquets, except it's not the same type. And so some people actually even use it like to gift those flowers, which then helps the spread even more. And then the plant, to just to make things worse, is also a bit like ragweed, so it gives rashes to humans but also animals. And so I've seen like cows, for instance, who ate in a field like full of it, and like they get like really, really bad ulcers like all over. And so it's really bad.
Yeah.
So you need to stop it, but it just spreads really quickly. And so far, like the best way to do it is like through pulling it, because if you don't pull from the roots, it's just going to regrow again. So it's a lot of effort, and sometimes biochemical or biocontrol measures, like maybe insects targeted at it, can be good, but we basically live in a world where our resources are basically finite, to tackle problems that seem quite infinite compared to them, right?
Yeah.
So then the idea is that, okay, if we can monitor at least the spread and the extent of it, then it might be better to make more informed decisions, where to put the resources to fight it off, maybe where the propagation front is. So that's basically the idea. And what is better than maybe satellite imaging to map on large scales? But then so that's the hope. But then the challenge is big, right? Because typical satellites these days, you get sort of resolutions of a couple of meters. But the plant is smaller than that. So you need the plant to spread enough, but also you need to tease it out from other things on the ground. And a green plant separated from another plant, that's also green as seen from space, is not so easy. So that's why we team up with like the people. This project was done in Pakistan, where the problem is quite acute. And these people there, they work for an international NGO. It's called CABI, and they're really great. They work in all kinds of countries across the world, and they did the ground survey, and we got over 3,500 data points from the ground, which is like the largest sample for that type of study on that plant that's ever been obtained. And so first we have like a really good sampling on in the Punjab province, and another one called KPK. So we just know on the more like traditional way how much there is in terms of spread. but also it provides then the data that we rely on from like the satellite to identify. So these days we hear about machine learning and artificial intelligence, and it's very like sort of like a hot topics, but people don't really understand necessarily the fact that it's not just a computer program that just like does things intelligently.
Yeah.
But basically you need to teach the computer program to recognize between, say, the weed and something else. So you basically need to, it's just like teaching a baby basically, or someone. You show them examples of what you want and what you don't want, and then the algorithms and the computer programs like basically teach itself to split them apart. But the more data you have, the more accurate or reliable they are, the better it is. So that's basically the project we've done. Hoping to kind of move on to other countries as well, applying the same idea. But it's we need to also make sure that like the type of data we're getting, that we can use the same artificial intelligence algorithms to like transpose directly to other parts of the Earth, which is not trivial because the plants will be different and everything. So we might need to kind of redo some of that process. But the other thing we found out is that, it's a very challenging problem, and it's not 100% reliable. We tend to be decently good at picking it up if it's extended, but we also label things that are not the weed that from space we might think is the weed. So there's room for improvement, and it shows that reliable ground measurements is also extremely important. But that's a first step, and we hope to just continue that in the future.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Like, I think, again, like someone, I don't really do astrophysics, so I couldn't have even, thought about these things, that this would be a possibility to study. So it's really nice to hear about these kind of different applications of specific fields. So, how in this project specifically, or in any other sort of multidisciplinary stuff that you've done, do you think like how easily would you say your skills from physics, your like degree, or being a researcher in astrophysics, how well do those skills transfer to studying something like food security, or something about plants?
Yeah, I think they transfer very well. I mean, if we talk about people with backgrounds in physics or astrophysics, I mean, we have good backgrounds with maths and like physics and sort of analysis, especially dealing with numbers. I teach a course that's Introduction to Data Science, and so everything that's like teasing out like numbers and statistics and everything, that's really like where I feel comfortable. So then, to some extent, you can just apply it to anything. It doesn't matter whether it's a star or if it's data from the ground about plants. I think the biggest burden is though to really learn about the field that you're studying. So that takes a little bit of time. And I also sometimes I feel like I'm so busy with everything, and though things move so fast that I cannot quite like really spend the time. But so it's a bit takes longer than I would wish. But it's more about learning like about the different field, how things are done. And I think the first recommendation really, or the first thing I try to do really, is to be very sort of humble about the way I do it, right? Because it's actually easier for me to do almost like collaborations outside my field than in my field, because I'm just very naive and very unfiltered, right? So I kind of like think of all kinds of crazy ideas, and I'm sort of tempted to try them. Whereas in my field, I feel like much more reluctant, because I'm like, oh yeah, somebody has thought about it before and this and that. So I'm much more like a children, playing in other fields. But at the same time, you have to be a bit careful. It's not just like in terms of like, human interactions, but more like well, some really smart people were there before me and might have thought about, the same idea I have. So you need to really, do your due diligence first, see what has been done and everything. So I think that's the most difficult thing really with trying something outside a bit like your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the challenge of doing that as well. And even in astrophysics, I've changed the exact area of research I've done like sort of a couple times, if I may say. I mean, I still do like what I did during my PhD to some extent, my work in other areas as well. And I like to this sort of change because that's how I feel more alive and I feel more challenged. But it takes a bit of energy, and I can see why we, especially with time, we become a bit sort of more static and reluctant to try new things because it's outside our comfort zone. Yes, I would say that's the most difficult challenge really with doing something else, because otherwise it's, in terms of actual techniques and everything, I mean, obviously I'm not like a plant biologist, so I don't do what they do, but as far as applying my skills with data, then it's not actually that difficult. And if anything, yeah, I've learned new things. But for instance, I had like one of my PhD students who, when he graduated, he wanted to, keep working in my team, and then he was maybe looking to go out of academia and do data science, but then I actually had like this funding through that project in a remote sensing, and I just hired him to work, on the data, and actually right away, I mean, he had to learn as well, about the new sort of area. But as far as like doing the analysis, he just like went through it, like as if it was working during his PhD. It was amazing, and I think that's the nice thing, being versatile. Like a lot of, I'm sure it's the same in other areas. So I don't want to say we're better than others, but certainly the people I know in physics, astrophysics, like they're really good at moving to other fields. And to some extent, sadly, a lot of my students, my really good final year undergrads who work with me on research projects, a lot of them, I try to convince them to do maybe a PhD with me. And these days, they just move on to doing data science or something, in the private industry, because they're just really good at programming and handling data, and they just go and apply their skills somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, I think probably for a lot of students, the money in working for a company is probably very tempting, especially when you graduate.
And I think it's fine because not everyone also is cut out for research.
Yeah,
to be
absolutely.
honest. It takes, it's very different from the industry to some extent, and it takes the right type of person. And some people, you don't need to be smarter or anything, but it's just in the nature of like the way the work is organized and everything that it's just different from working in the industry, I think.
Sure.
So I believe the most natural pathway for most students, at the undergrad level, is to go in the industry as well afterwards, and it's just really nice, that the skills they have are super useful.
Mm-hmm. So talking about skills and kind of knowledge in physics, this is a bit of a silly question, but bear with me. So would you say you know everything about physics?
No. Absolutely not. I feel like I'm learning more about physics, about the things I didn't know before, but then I discovered that there's new things that I didn't know before that now I need to learn about. Well, but that's also why, I mean, at the very start of the interview with the question about why physics and why it's useful and everything, I mean, it's the curiosity, right? So it just seems to never end. Otherwise, I would probably get bored, and then maybe I would start doing medicine or biology or whatever. Yeah, so there's always something to learn. But I knew it, but when I was an undergrad, I was struggling and, I had to study really hard, and half of what I learned about electromagnetism, I didn't really understand. And I was just glad to pass the exam and whatnot. And And these days, well, sometimes I have to teach it, right? So I do have to, look back and understand too. And it's when I explain to students, that's why I find it rewarding, because I also learn. I mean, explaining to them makes me learn. And there's so much that I'm like, oh, I was really an idiot. But actually, I was not an idiot. It's just that, there's a limited amount I could learn at a given time. So yeah, so a lot. I kind of wish I could redo my undergrads just now, like just to see if I would actually be better. Because I feel like I understand more of the sort of basic physics, but there's also always new things. It just never stops.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very kind of sobering feeling you get when you so I'm in my final year now, and I think when I was in my first year, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be a master of physics, I'm gonna know everything, and I don't I know I'm not going to know everything, and it's a very kind of narrow thing, narrow field that you always go into. So and I think even in your narrow field, you probably don't know everything, and you probably never will in a way, but that's
right.
kind of what drives you. So
and I guess you probably experience that as well when you it's a big contrast when you get to uni, I think, in particular, because it moves a bit from more like learning by heart or whatever to really applying things yourself, and there's a bit more like kind of well, not freedom, but openness in the way that things are structured as well. And in the first year, like a lot of people or everyone struggles with exams and whatnot, and they're like, oh, I used to know everything, because I think it was maybe in more like A-level or high school, it's more possible, perhaps, if you're good in an area, to kind of have the feeling. Doesn't mean you do, but to sort of understand everything. But then when you get to uni, then you just can't. And also maybe the pace of everything you learn there's much more, and then you no longer have that feeling, and then it's very unsettling.
Definitely, yeah. And I think in high school or A-level or whatever, I think there were a lot of things that were kind of not wrong, but they were kind of taught in a simple way. And then when you got to uni, you were like, oh, that was completely different to what it actually is. And I think that's also a very interesting feeling. So I've got a final question. So now that we're talking about sort of schools and things like that, what sort of advice would you give somebody who is in school right now, who might be either thinking about a career in physics or who might not quite be sure what they would be doing? Do you have any advice for those people?
Yeah. Well, I would say, probably curiosity and, sort of just being interested in stuff is probably the best advice, and being passionate. I think because, like as I said before, in high school, I was really into sport, and I was okay at science, but I was not really pursuing it just because it didn't seem as fun on the face of it, and I'm not blaming teachers and everything, but sometimes it's a bit more difficult in the pure academic setting. And I just found that actually the most interest, my interest grew mostly on the sort of non-academic aspect. So I would, do stargazing. I would do, became member of a amateur astronomy society. Then also I participated to like science fairs as well. And, science fairs might look academic, but, it's really sort of more about like putting together a small research project and presenting it. And something that has almost like nothing to do with what you see in class day to day, because it's completely, based on something you're interested in. And I think that really drove my passion for science. And then, okay, maybe my maths or physics class was maybe a bit boring or something at a time or whatever, but I knew that, beyond that, there was something really interesting, that this was driving me to be capable of properly studying, afterwards. So I would say that's probably the best advice I would have for anyone, really, is to, stop thinking just in terms of, what's happening in the classroom, but, developing interest beyond. And because there's so much out there, right? People can buy a small Raspberry Pi, they can learn programming, they can, fiddle with engineering and electronics. There's astronomy societies. There's so much on offer with internet as well these days. YouTube and whatnot. So I think it's really to be passionate about something and not just be a bystander, of like the education system, because it does really well, teaching us everything, but it's not necessarily there sometimes in the right way to push our passion. And often, I give talks in astronomy societies, around the world and the country. And I meet a lot of people, say, my age, kind of like middle age or whatnot. And they're like, oh, you know what? Like, I wish I had studied physics and not done blah or whatever. And it's just because, in their 20s, they were a bit like I almost became, which is not finding these passions that drove me. And they just just missed the boat. And so, yes, I think it's really important.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. I think I very much resonate with that, and I think that's kind of what UMPO is doing. Like what we're trying to do as well in schools is to go in and show them that there is more to sort of physics than just, or maths, just like calculating things on paper, and it's actually like a lot of fun things as well that you can do. I think that's really good advice. I think that's all the questions I have. Would you like to? Do you have?
No, I was just gonna say, like, for instance, I've yet to meet someone who is not like sort of really, sort of very, very curious or astounded by black holes or something like that, right? Almost like, no one told me, black holes are just really boring. Don't tell me about like a star being, sucked in by a black hole or whatever, right? Almost everyone I've met, they're all like very curious about it and whatnot. Yet, to fully understand, maybe you need to do some maths and some physics, right? So I think and a lot of fields are like that as well, not just physics, but, for instance, I was not so much into biology, and that's probably because I could not see the bigger picture behind, and, after watching, like, I don't know, ER or TV shows where you see a bit more, well, I don't know, it's probably not pictured like, 100% right. But when you see a bit the big picture, I'm like, oh, maybe I could have made a career in medicine, or maybe as biology, or these COVID things these days with the vaccine work. I'm like, wow, that seems really amazing. Maybe I could have done work in microbiology or whatnot. But yeah, so try stuff and you'll find something interesting, and science has a lot to offer.
Definitely. And I think like another thing is like, you don't have to settle on one thing, right? Like if you suddenly woke up and was like, okay, I'm gonna be a medical doctor, sure, why not? Like you can go and do it. So yeah, definitely don't just settle for one thing. Okay. Thank you so much again for sitting down.
You're welcome.
And letting me ask silly questions.
Thank you for joining us for today's interview. We hope you enjoyed it and that you will join us tomorrow when we meet Alessandro, a theoretical physicist. Don't forget to like and subscribe and spread the word to your friends. The hashtag is BSW21 and our social media accounts are @UOMPhysOutreach. We'd love to hear from you.